Okay, so now we're going to talk about connective tissue. Now, this is the largest and most abundant type of tissue in the body, and it's going to provide a protective structural framework for all their tissue types. As we talked about with epithelial tissue, it is actually the underlying tissue that helps to support epithelial tissue. It is also the most diverse tissue of the body, and there are three basic components. You're going to have cells, although not as many as you would see with epithelial tissue. You're going to have extracellular protein fibers, and then a fluid extracellular matrix, which is filled with ground substance, which is essentially just filler. So in connective tissue, you're going to have cells that are going to be surrounded by the matrix. And the matrix can vary from connective tissue to connective tissue. It could be very little, or it can actually compose most of the actual tissue, such as what we see with blood, with mostly liquid plasma. It's formed from extracellular fibers and ground substance, that's the matrix, and it accounts for a majority of the tissue volume for connective tissue. Connective tissue is really never exposed to the outside environment. That would be that of epithelial tissue. Many connective tissues are highly vascular, which means that they have a very rich blood supply. They will also contain sensory receptors, which are nerve endings. They pick up various types of signals from many types of receptors. The functions of connective tissue are that of support and protection, transportation of materials, storage of energy reserves, and body defenses. And what we mean by that for support and protection, bone and cartilage are types of connective tissue, and they provide physical support for the body. Transportation of materials, blood is a connective tissue, and that transports nutrients, oxygen, waste products around the body. Storage of energy reserves, this would be fat or adipose tissue. And then defense of the body, this could be blood, again, with your white blood cells. So there are three major types of connective tissue. We have what's called connective tissue proper, and there are loose forms and dense forms of that. We have our fluid connective tissue, which would include blood and lymph. And then we have our supporting connective tissues, which would be cartilage and bone. So looking at connective tissue proper, this will consist of many cell types. So it's going to be pretty diverse. The matrix will contain extracellular fibers and more of a syrupy ground substance. You're typically going to find connective tissue proper in the tissue that we find underneath the skin, that of fatty tissue or fat areas, fat pads, as well as tendons and ligaments. Now, the typical cell that we find in connective tissue proper are called fibroblasts. They're always present in that particular type of tissue. It is the most abundant permanent cell in connective tissue proper, and it will produce connective tissue fibers as well as the ground substance. Fibrocytes will differentiate from the fibroblasts, which fibrocytes will help to maintain the connective tissue fibers. You might also find some macrophages. Now, some of you may have heard of these before, but macrophages are actually phagocytic cells. The process of phagocytosis is when a cell essentially engulfs or eats either cell debris or another cell or damaged proteins, and the phagocytic cell will then degrade whatever it ingests. Macrophages are a very common white blood cell, and what they do is they will phagocytize damaged cells or pathogens that enter into the tissue. And they can also release chemicals that can actually help to expand out the immune response. Fat cells or adipocytes, these are permanent residents. Each cell contains a large lipid droplet, and the number of fat cells can vary from individual to individual. Mast cells, these are small mobile cells often found near blood vessels. The cytoplasm is packed with granules. It's filled with histamine and heparin, and it's released to begin body defensive activities after an injury or an infection. Now, we mentioned that there are different types of fibers that can be found in connective tissues, and there's three: collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers, and a connective tissue can contain one, it can contain two of these, or it can actually have all three. So there are many different combinations of these types of fibers. That's actually what helps to define one connective tissue from another. But getting back, collagen fibers, these are thick, straight, unbranched, and very strong. They contain the protein collagen. This is the most common type of fiber. And this really just adds a lot of support to the actual tissue. Elastic fibers, think of these as a little bit like rubber bands. They return to their original length after stretching, and they contain a protein called elastin. So if you have a connective tissue that has a lot of elastic fibers, it's going to give you a little bit more of stretchiness to the tissue. Reticular fibers, these are made of collagen protein, but they're arranged differently than collagen fibers. Instead, you're going to have thin, branching, more interwoven in various organs. This just adds more support than your just typical collagen fiber. So let's look at the loose different types of connective tissue proper. This is what we refer to as the packing material of the body. More ground substance, fewer fibers, and that's why, because you have fewer fibers, that's why it's referred to as loose connective tissue. The first type would be areolar connective tissue. This is going to fill spaces between organs and provide cushioning. It will also support epithelial tissue, and examples are found underneath the epidermis, within the dermis. The epidermis is your outer layer of the skin, and the dermis is more of the layer that supports the epidermis. Adipose connective tissue, this is fat. This is going to store lipids. It's involved in insulation, protection around organs. Examples, padding for kidneys, under the skin, the abdominal area, breast area is where you'll find a lot of these types of this type of tissue. Reticular connective tissue, this forms a framework of soft organs. And this is something that we'll typically find on lymph nodes, the spleen, as well as the bone marrow. And here we can see areolar, again, the functions there in typical locations. You can see what it looks like. You can see adipose and then reticular tissue. The dense connective tissue, this comes in two forms: dense regular and dense irregular, and it's really going to be the arrangement of the fibers that'll distinguish between the two. Dense connective tissue is very tough, strong, and durable. It has more fibers, mostly collagen, less ground substance. It helps to resist tension and distortion of the tissue. If you look up top there, that's dense regular. You can see all the fibers are nice and parallel, versus dense irregular, which is the fibers going every which way. But the dense regular connective tissue, if you were to pull in the direction that the fibers are running, you would have a lot of support. However, if you were to pull in the opposite direction, out towards the sides, looking at this image, you can see that any pressure of pulling in that direction would tear this tissue very easily. And this is something that we see in tendons and ligaments, and that's why sometimes tendons and ligaments will tear if you make a movement that really should not have been made. Versus the dense irregular connective tissue, where you're really going to have support no matter which way you pull on that tissue. So with dense irregular connective tissue, the collagen fibers are not parallel versus the dense regular, where they are. Your fluid connective tissues, this will include blood and lymph. You have distinct cell types in a fluid matrix with dissolved proteins. The watery matrix in blood is referred to as plasma. And the cell types in blood are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells are important for carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. White blood cells are important in immune response, and platelets are involved in blood clotting. Your supportive connective tissues, this is going to provide strong framework that supports the rest of the body. The matrix contains numerous fibers. In some, also contain deposits of calcium, as we see with bone. The two main types of supporting connective tissue are cartilage and bone. So cartilage is a firm gel matrix that contains embedded fibers. You're going to have chondrocytes or cartilage cells. These are contained in small pockets called lacuna. Cartilage is actually an avascular tissue, which means it does not have any blood supply. The chondrocytes will obtain nutrients and eliminate waste by diffusion through the matrix. Because of this avascular nature, that really limits its repair ability. And that's why when you tear cartilage, it may not repair very quickly, if at all. There are three types of cartilage. We have hyaline, elastic, and fiber cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant. It will provide hyaline cartilage will provide stiff but somewhat flexible support, and it reduces friction between the bony surfaces. This is what you typically find in most of your joints. Elastic cartilage, this is found in the auricle, the ear, the actual part of the ear that you can see. The epiglottis, which is a little flap that blocks your trachea when you swallow. And this will provide support, but it also tolerates distortion without damage and returns to its original shape. That's why you can take your ear and twist it around and it will go back to where it was. Fibrocartilage, these are pads within the knee joint and within the pubic bones where the two hip joints meet, as well as in between your vertebrae. The thing that all three of these have in common is these are very high pressure areas. And fibrocartilage resists compression. It prevents bone to bone contact and limits the movement. And it really, again, is found in these very high pressure areas. That's why people, if you, for example, have a herniated disc in your spine, what that means is this fibrocartilage is actually bulging out and you have bone on bone, which is very painful. One of the ways that they fix that is they might remove the disc and then just fuse the two vertebrae together with like little braces so that they do not rub up against each other. Okay, so again, just a little summary on the three types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant type. The matrix with collagen fibers is there, provides tough, somewhat flexible support, will help to reduce friction between bones. And again, it's located at the ends of bones. It will connect the ribs to the sternum. It also conducts passageways of the respiratory tract, such as forming your trachea and bronchi. And it also forms most of your nose. Elastic cartilage, the matrix contains collagen fibers and elastic fibers. It's resilient yet flexible. Locations are the external ear and the epiglottis, so the two main ones. And again, fibrocartilage, very little ground substance. Matrix is densely packed with parallel collagen fibers. It's an extremely durable and tough tissue. It resists compression, absorbs shock, prevents bone-on-bone contact. We typically find this within the knee joints, between pubic bones, and within the intervertebral disc. Bone, or osseous tissue. Here you have a very small volume of ground substance. Matrix of hard calcium compounds and flexible collagen fibers. It's very strong. It resists shattering. It's highly vascularized. Bone cells or osteocytes. These are also contained in these little cavities or small pockets called lacuna. And I don't know, you can see that here. You can see each one of these little dots right here. This is actually a bone cell. All of this white, this is all calcium phosphate. So looking here, you can see the lacuna here, and within that lacuna, you'd have an osteocyte. Bone is very highly vascularized. It has a very rich network of blood supply. And it obtains its nutrients through cytoplasmic extensions running through a branching network within the matrix, meaning the blood vessels are really interwoven within the structure of bone. Okay, we have a few different types of tissue membranes. These are physical barriers that line or cover portions of the body. They consist of both epithelium and connective tissue usually, but they may be connective almost exclusively. There are four types of membranes: mucous, serous, synovial, and cutaneous. So your mucous membranes, or mucosa, these line passageways that open to the exterior. Examples of this would be your digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. So all of those open tubes that are part of those various systems are going to be lined with mucous membranes. Mucous membranes will consist of epithelial surfaces that are kept moist at all times, typically by the secretion of mucus. The type of epithelium tissue varies. The meaning, is it simple squamous or is it stratified squamous? That's the type that can vary. And then most likely the connective tissue layer that underlies the mucous membranes is going to be areolar tissue, and that's referred to as the lamina propria. Serous membranes, these will line cavities, not open to the outside. It's usually a simple epithelium supported by areolar tissue, and it consists of two layers: parietal layer, which lines the cavity, and a visceral layer, which covers the actual organ. Typically, there's serous fluid between the parietal and visceral layers, and this will help to reduce the friction between those two layers. There's three serous membranes throughout the body: pleura, which line the pleural cavities and cover the lungs; peritoneum, which lines the peritoneal cavity and covers most of your abdominal organs, your digestive organs; and the pericardium, which lines the pericardial cavity, and this will cover the heart. The cutaneous membrane is your skin. This will actually be our whole next chapter, chapter 5. This covers the surface of the body. The epithelium is stratified squamous epithelium. Connective tissue consists of areolar and underlying dense irregular connective tissue. This particular type of tissue is very thick and relatively waterproof and usually dry. Okay, and that is it for connective tissue and the tissue membranes. Again, tissue membranes will be formed from both epithelial and connective tissues. So let's move on to muscle tissue. This particular tissue, along with nervous tissue, these two types of tissue actually are what we call excitable, which means they can receive electrical impulses and signal via electrical impulses. So muscle tissue is specialized for contraction. Slender individual cells called muscle fibers that will contract due to interactions between filaments of proteins called myosin and actin. So these two proteins will interact with each other and cause the muscle fibers to contract. Muscle tissue can be voluntary or involuntary. What that means is if it's voluntary, you have conscious control over moving that muscle. If it's involuntary, you do not have any conscious control over moving it. Actually, the part of the nervous system referred to as the autonomic nervous system will regulate that particular type of tissue. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal is the only voluntary. Cardiac and smooth are involuntary. So looking at skeletal muscle fibers, these move or stabilize the position of the skeleton. They contain very large and long multinucleated cells. New muscle fibers produced by the division of stem cells. Myosin and actin proteins are arranged in repeating patterns, giving the cells a striated appearance. Striated means it has those striations or lines that you can visibly see. And again, this is a voluntary muscle. This is the muscle that is going to involve all movements that you can physically move consciously. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. Typical cell is smaller than that of skeletal muscle fiber, 1 or 2 nuclei per cell. Cells show branching and interconnections at intercalated disc, and this allows for coordinated contraction. One of the very common features is these intercalated discs, which are just little tubes that connect the muscle fibers to each other. Cardiac muscle does not repair very easily, and as such, cardiac muscle, if you have damage due to a heart attack, it's oftentimes replaced by scar tissue, so you're losing muscle mass. It is a striated involuntary muscle. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of blood vessels around hollow organs, such as the urinary bladder, in the walls of the stomach, uterus, and trachea. These are small, slender cells, tapered or narrowed at the ends. Division and regeneration after injury, non-striated, involuntary muscle type. Nervous tissue, or also called nerve tissue. These are specialized for transmitting electrical impulses, most concentrated in the brain and spinal cord. They will rapidly sense internal or external environmental changes, and they process information and control responses. 2 types of neural cells. You have neurons. This is the primary cell. Neurons are responsible for communicating through electrical events and very limited ability to repair after injury. That's why if you have nerve damage, it's not something that can necessarily be repaired. Neuroglial, these are supporting cells. They provide physical support for neural tissue, maintain chemical composition of neural tissue fluids, supply nutrients to the neurons, defend tissue from infections as well. Okay. Obviously, tissue can be damaged. Not all tissue can be repaired. Tissues respond to injuries and maintain homeostasis by restoring to homeostasis by 2 mechanisms. That of inflammation to bring white blood cells to help clean up the area, and potential infections that may have entered, and then regeneration of the tissue. So here's just a little schematic that goes over how tissue can actually repair itself with the process of inflammation and regeneration. I would like you just to know generally why inflammation is important and regeneration is important to tissue repair. So just look over this. Again, big picture here is that with inflammation, you are increasing blood flow to the area. You also will have pain, which will alert damage to the tissue, but the increased blood flow to the area will bring the white blood cells to help clean up mess with a lot of those phagocytic cells that will actually eat up a lot of the cell debris. And then once you clean up the area, you can then undergo a regeneration process where if the tissue is able to undergo mitosis and repair itself, it will. Okay, and that is it for Chapter 4.